Hi, welcome to my workshop. Today I'm building the debris vessel BD5. But first, there was a tragedy that occurred in 1982 involving this vessel. That was when the Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the Potomac in Washington, D.C. It was taking off in a snowstorm, but unfortunately never climbed, and it crashed into a bridge and the river with a total of 78 fatalities. There was a massive rescue and then recovery operation that went on for 11 days, with the salvaging operation taking a few more days beyond that. It was during this that the debris removal vessel BD5 and its sister BD6 were used in the recovery. They're usually used for removing debris that floats down the river. They're part of the Baltimore district of the Army Corps of Engineers. And BD5 that was used in the recovery and salvaging was found recently in Northeast Maryland. Chris Corse, the owner of Conowingo Models, discovered it sitting on a low buoy and essentially rusting away. But he thought it might be a nice project for a kit. So he started working up some designs and laser cutting some parts. He got partway through that when he sent one of them to me and told me to see what I could do with it. Now, who doesn't love a good challenge? I decided I was going to try to model it the way it's sitting today. So I started by cutting a piece of basswood and sanding it so it would fit onto the bow and the stern of the boat. Then I glued one piece onto the stern and glued the other piece onto the bow and clamped them while they dried. Then I used a variety of sanding sticks to round off the corners. And next up, I cut a piece of 10,000 styrene. That was going to make up the rest of the hull that went underneath the boat. Then, after making sure it fit, I used super glue and clamped it in place, working my way from the stern up to the bow. Then, to get the last bit of it in place while it dried, I used tape to hold it. Then I did a little bit of sanding to make sure everything was lined up. Then used some plastic putty to fill a few holes on the deck and to fill the seams in between my hull and the sides. Then I started cutting some 30,000 styrene, and this was going to be used for the roof of the superstructure and the front of the cab. I first cut and fit the roof that goes over the engine compartment. Then, after sanding all of the putty that had dried, I started my first round of priming the ship so I could see what I needed to do to it. Then it was time to work on the front of the cab. I used some styrene quarter round, and that was going to be my corners for the cab. I used super glue to glue it in place, and then cut down the piece that was going to be the actual front. Once I cut it out and fit it, I had to cut a window in it. I made my measurements and then used a scalpel to cut out the window. Then I fit it back in place to make sure everything worked. I then started working on the roof of the cab. I had to round the corners on it And then I test fit everything in place just to make sure they fit. After the priming, I noticed a few gaps that I wanted to fill with putty, so I went back around the boat and finished those off. I had also ordered a few bits from Seaport Model Works, and I started attaching those around on the deck of the ship. Then I glued the front of the cab in place. I also mocked up a handrail to go around it that looked like the original. I then put a second coat of primer on everything. And lastly, before painting it, I put some edging around the front window. Now it was time to put down my first coat. I used a red primer, as the only color this was really going to have was going to be rust. And this was my base coat. Once I had the boat and the roofs primed, I started to work on rusting it. I masked off the waterline as there was a definite color shift between above and below it. Then I used a camouflage Krylon, and while it was still wet, I used a lot of my rusting powders and sprinkled them on it and allowed it to dry. This started getting me the look that I was after. I realized I needed to build the bumpers that had been retrofitted to the boat, so I started making those out of styrene. And then I painted them the same primer color and glued them onto the front of the boat. Then, after putting some acetate in for the windows, I glued the two roofs in place. Then I made a couple little smokestacks that were evident on the boat as it was sitting, and I test fit them to see how they'd look in place. Now for the flagpole on the back, I just took a thin styrene rod and melted the end of it. Then I painted my two smokestacks. To make the propeller, I cut out the inside of a small metal wheel and twisted all of the spokes to look like blades. Then I glued it in place with the rudder and some other parts I made out of styrene to look like what I could see in the photos that Chris had taken. Then I rusted up and weathered that area. And now it was time to start doing a general rusting all over the ship. In this case, I was using a mixture of gouaches, which are like water-soluble oil paints, and pigments. And this allows you to get a lot of texture into your surface. And as I kept working on it, I kept comparing it to the photos. I then glued on the smokestacks after I had done the first round of rusting. Then I kept going back and forth, alternating between more artist pigments and paints, going after the look that was in the photographs. And I'd keep working on different areas of it and comparing it back to the photograph. And I was pretty close, but I still had a little bit of work to do in matching some of the shades and matching that spot on the door that had been left from the Corps of Engineers emblem. But I got it to where I was pretty happy with it. And now the next thing to do is to get a low buoy for it to sit on. And if you're interested in this one, Chris is also working on a version where it shows it in its working years. Thank you for watching.